From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wichman. First up is a report on the latest activity in the cattle market with K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. He says the market was fairly consistent with the pre-holiday expectations. We'll also hear excerpts from the latest podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. Veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weber, and livestock economist Dustin Pendle discuss early weaning calves in light of drought-stressed pasture conditions, as well as the economic implications of more aggressive control measures against highly costly BRD. And K-State wildlife specialist Charlie Lee looks at research into methods of controlling woodpecker damage to wood-sided homes and outbuildings. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wichman. Well, coming off of the Memorial Day holiday, we begin our broadcast week with a report on the activity taking place in the cattle market, which K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor says is living up to expectations. Glynn, first off, maybe just a look at the futures market.
Sure. Yeah, this past week we had some recovery from the prior week. I'll quickly remind our listeners the prior week was really rough, so it was nice to kind of have a bounce back. The June live cattle contract closed the week just under 105. That was up about $2.50 for the week. And then looking at the feeder cattle market, the nearby August contract closed at 145.5. That was up a full $7 for the week. And before I jump into the cash trade, one of the comments I made last week actually was the markets can work like a pendulum sometimes. They might overreact, and usually where they should be is in the middle, and like a grandfather clock, they go too far left or right, whatever. And this past week definitely felt like a bounce back week to recover from an overreaction the week before, particularly the feeder cattle market. When I see that $7 bounce back, that's a big increase. We've seen it before, but it's not normal, and I think it's mainly just to offset some overreaction the week before. When we go over the cash trade, live fed cattle, 5-market average was at 113, was Friday's trade. I will note, however, less than 1,000 head traded, so that was very light, and particularly light given the volume animals are moving through the system right now. That's off $2 for the week. We'll wait and see if the post-holiday trade picks up in volume, particularly in that market. When we look at feeder cattle, depending on what market around the country I'd quote, they were flat to, like AMS called them, $2 to $5 up. So again, consistent with the futures market, feeder cattle were up. A couple specific examples here in Kansas. The Pratt market, 6 to 7 weights, traded 152 to the low 160s. 8 to 9 weight yearlings were 131 to 137. Each of those would be up about $3 from the prior week. So we had some recovery in cash market on feeder cattle that mimicked what we saw on the board. Feeder cattle, we didn't have the recovery, but I think it was on low volume, so we'll see what this coming week has. The last thing in the cash marketplace I'll point out is exactly what wholesale beef was doing. Choice cutout was at 227.5 on Friday. That was actually $5 off, so that was giving up some of the strength from the prior week. Select was 204.5. That puts the Choice Select spread at about $23. And I'm highlighting that because for about 6 weeks now, we've been intently watching the difference between Choice Select spread. And, Jeff, we do that as a monitor of how strong beef demand is. So all else equal, when that widens, that means people are paying up more for beef because Choice is preferred to Select. And we're sort of on par with where we were last year. Early in June last year, we peaked at $30. So we'll be watching over the next 2 or 3 weeks to see if we continue to widen that. We kind of have the Memorial Day bounce behind us. Before we started recording, you and I were talking about grilling, and that showed up, I think, in demand strength, at least domestically. Now we're going to look to the 4th of July, and one of the things I'll be looking for through June is whether that Choice Select spread continues to widen. There's some reason for optimism, is we're calling for lots of dry, warm weather around the countryside. While we may not like sitting outside sweating so much, it is favorable for grilling, so we may actually see an additional grilling demand bump here in June.
Maybe less travel as well.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, higher gas prices are being talked about, and that might keep people at home. Maybe they'll grill at home and not run out to the restaurant the same. What the net of that is for beef demand gets a little mixed because you can buy beef at a restaurant too, but nonetheless, 'tis the season for grilling, and it's worth watching that from now through about the third week of June. Most of the 4th of July purchasing behavior is done in advance, so the month of June is critical for that holiday.
What about in terms of the USDA reports? What are we seeing there?
Yeah, so there was 2 big reports that came out last week that most of our listeners are regularly aware of these. One was a non-mover, and one's probably worth paying attention to. The cattle on feed report came out actually early on Friday because it was going into the holiday. And on balance, I'm going to call it a non-market mover. So basically, all the numbers in that report were consistent with expectations. So before the report, there's an unofficial pre-report estimate, and the official numbers align with the pre-report unofficial numbers. Specifically, May 1st on feed, animals on feed, came in at 5% higher than the prior May. That's right in line with what the market was expecting. Placements in the month of April were down 8% compared to the prior April. That's also consistent with expectations. But folks shouldn't forget that it's the second month in a row we've had a pullback because prior to that we had multiple months of notable increases. Here in South, we've had lots of dry weather, wheat pasture concerns and so forth, where we've pulled cattle forward into feedlots early. Well, you can only do that for so long before you, to some degree, run out of feeder cattle. So in April, the placements being down was mainly because of that. April marketings were actually up 6% compared to the prior April. That's, again, right in line with expectations and consistent with 5 to 8 months earlier, the surge in placements. Just the fact we have a bigger calf crop, we're working through the system. We can continue to see the marketing numbers up. That in itself is good because we're keeping fed cattle weights in check. So we're not having extra big animals, yet we're having more animals go through the system. So there's a mitigating factor there on we're not putting, quote unquote, too much beef on the marketplace.
Cold storage is also looking good?
Yeah, so the second report would be cold storage. And for our listeners, this is a monthly report to figure out how much meat is on the freezer, how much is out there that has yet to clear the market, if you like. This one's a little more worrisome. I called the cattle on feed report a non-mover. The cold storage one might have just a bit of a bearish tone to it. And what I mean by that is it continues to show us evidence that meat is growing in the freezer space, and it's going to put the burden on both domestic and foreign demand to move that meat. We already knew it, but this report just confirms that. Specifically, total red meat supplies were up 4% from the prior month, a full 7% compared to the prior year. They've been up for a while. They've been up because of pork and poultry until this report. So pork was up 5% from the prior month. Poultry's up 2%. Both of those are up 9 and 7% respectively compared to the prior year. But what's new here is now beef is up as well. So beef is up 2% from last month, and it's up a full 3% from the same time a year ago. So all 3 major meats had month-over-month and year-over-year increases. And we knew this was coming just because total meat production is growing. But in the past, we've had kind of flat numbers for beef, and we were watching for cross-meat concerns about pork and poultry supplies growing. Well, now we've got to monitor the beef supplies growing as well. So any kind of hiccup, and the reason I'm highlighting this, is any kind of step back on export demand. We've been exporting a lot this year, which is proverbially saved our bacon, if you like. We need to continue to do that. And domestic demand, back to our grilling discussion this summer and so forth, both of those have to remain strong. Otherwise, we're going to see some additional weakness throughout the cattle complex on prices. So I like to watch the cold storage report just to give us a sense of how much meat is right there ready to go through the marketplace. And anytime it starts stacking up there, we see the burden on demand grow. So it's going to be important that consumers, both domestically and abroad, continue to want to pay up for U.S. beef.
And is that more of a political concern, or is that more of a what the countries want concern?
So on the foreign export demand front, I think it's primarily political and trade deal negotiations concerns. And I sound a little bit like a broken record because for over a year I've been concerned about this because some of those discussions are ongoing and we don't know what the end game is. However, to take my Dr. Bear hat off for a moment and be, unbiased and assess the situation, folks like me have been concerned for over a year, and yet we continue to export more beef. So that tells me there is some on-the-ground desire by those consumers in those countries that is pulling that beef into their country, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. The U.S. beef has comparative advantages in lots of ways around the world, and we're producing more of it, so we're set up favorably to feed into that desire to purchase our high-quality beef. I think if we keep the politics and the trade deals to some extent at bay, that will continue to be supportive for the U.S. cattle complex.
In terms of beef basis projections for 2018, what are we seeing there?
Yeah, so periodically I like to kind of back up and say, where are the key marketing decisions for producers? And for a moment, we'll talk about cow-calf producers. Most people in this country, a little over 3/4 of the calves, are born in the spring. They're weaned in September through early November. So that September, early November time period is the most common period where calves are sold. So while we are here at the end of May, it's never too early to start looking forward at what those prices would be, potentially locking in prices, potentially doing early summer sales, those kind of things. That's why I bring this up periodically. And there is a resource called beefbasis.com. It's a website you can go and kind of do this for yourself. I won't belabor here how it works, but what it's doing is pulling market information every night to give a projected cash price for lots of locations around the country, different weights, different sex of animals, and so forth. And the specific one I always use is the Salina market here in Kansas, just because it's the one closest to where we're recording. A lot of our listeners can relate to it. But as of May 28th, the market projections for a calf that would be 5.5 weights, Salina, Kansas, sold on October 17th, so that's just the middle Wednesday of the month for an example here, the cash price that's being projected is $162. And to give some context, that's much better than most of us thought it would be at this point in the quote-unquote herd expansion. We've grown the herd by quite a bit, and the main reason for that is demand has been stronger than we thought, so it's elevated those cattle prices. For context, from a profitability perspective, if a cow-calf producer can run a cow for $850 per year, which is a crude rule of thumb that fits a lot of producers, then that equates to about a $40 per cow positive return if they're able to sell their calf for $162. I highlight that because at this point in the cattle cycle, we don't normally talk about positive returns, so it is possible that somebody that's close to an average cost producer might still have a good year. Not the best year they've ever had, but still positive return. So that's a good thing, and again, a testament to how strong beef demand is. But the other reason I highlight it is a little bit less the last week, but the week before when the market pulled back hard and off and on through the month of March, there's a lot of volatility in the cattle marketplace. And for those that are more concerned about that, there is an opportunity to alleviate some of that and lock in a small but positive margin if you are an average cow-calf producer. So looking at futures hedges, put options, the LRP contract the USDA has out there, there's different ways to do that. But it starts with trying to understand what your expected cash price is and deciding whether or not you want to attempt to lock that in and limit down price movement. And that's why I like to share that information.
All right, Glynn. Thanks for the update.
Thank you, Jeff.
That's K-State Livestock Market economist Glynn Tonsor. You can find additional information online at agmanager.info. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today is back now. Well, our friends at the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State have once again gathered round the table for another podcast session on lead topics in cattle production and health management, they being veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, cow-calf specialist Bob Weber, and livestock economist Dustin Pendle. And here for you a portion of this week's podcast. Here's Brad.
Welcome to BCI Cattle Chat, and we welcome your questions. If you want to send us questions on Twitter, it's at @_BCI, or you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu, or visit our website, beefcattleinstitute.org. We're happy to have you with us and joining us today. On today's episode, we've got everyone here, Dr. Weber, Dr. Pendle, Dr. Larson, and we're going to be discussing early weaning. And we'll talk some about the cost of BRD and how we could reduce some of those costs. I'll start out with one of the questions, and I think a couple of you guys have received this as we talked with different people, had some dry weather this spring. The grass didn't come on as good as it wanted. And I know, Dr. Larson, you had received a question from somebody about, what about early weaning? Pros, cons, benefits? You want to talk to that a bit?
Yes, and I think particularly if we continue as dry as we have been, a lot of people should be looking at some ways to reduce grazing pressure on grass that's not growing as we would like it. And one of the ways you can do it that doesn't hurt your base herd production for the future is to early wean those calves.
How early?
When I've been involved with early weaning, and most people I've talked to, it's when they're 6 weeks or more. By the time that a calf is 6 weeks of age, his rumen is actually functioning pretty well, and he's consuming a fair amount of forage on those pastures, and that's about the time actually that we're getting past peak lactation of the cow. So the calf is able to do pretty well as a weaned animal at that stage. Even though that's not typical to wean a calf at that age, they can certainly do pretty well.
So 6 to 8 weeks or greater, as long as you're above that, you
right.
should be doing pretty good. What's the impact of that to the grazing? Because those calves aren't eating that much.
Well, it's not so much what the calves are eating; it's the lactation requirement of the beef cows. And so there's a fair bit of data that says that about a 30% reduction in nutrient demand when you wean a calf. So when you dry off that cow, her maintenance costs and lactation costs both go down substantially. And I know Casey Olson, one of our colleagues here, did some research a few years ago, and they figured that every day a calf was weaned early provided 2 additional grazing days during the dry period. So
every day early that he was weaned, and that's early compared to our typical
7-8 months
weaning.
Yep.
Every day was 2 additional grazing days
for the cow. Yep. So you can really extend your forage resource a lot by just taking the calf off. So
what about weaning? I mean, we're talking about early weaning, but does that same hold true if you wean at 5 months instead of 7?
Yep. That same rule applies. That in fact, in Flint Hills here, it's not uncommon to talk to producers about moving weaning up from an October date into maybe a mid-August date, principally as a strategy to preserve both winter grazing days, so leaving standing forage for cows to graze in winter, but preserve body condition. We lose substantial body condition on cows during that dormant resource. The other bit to remember is you take a, say, 2-month-old or 3-month-old calf. One, they don't eat a lot, so their the density of the diet has to be really high. But those little buggers are ultra efficient.
Yeah, the feed to gain is really good at this stage.
And it's much better than, in fact, we think about, cow provides lactation. Well, feed conversion on feeding the cow, the losses of that to milk, to the calf, losses of that, it's about a 3 or 4-fold more advantageous in terms of efficiency to directly feed the calf than it is to feed the cow and let the cow feed the calf.
So what should you feed those calves? Yeah. Is it primary forage based, or are you talking? You said high energy density. I'm picturing corn. You're not starting on corn.
You don't want to start them on corn. So it has to be nutrient dense, and so typically a high protein, really palatable diet probably needs to be somewhere in the 18% crude protein range. So a lot of times using some of the
byproduct feeds, soy hulls, corn gluten feed, some of those types of things are pretty good because there's not a lot of starch in there, but a pretty nutrient dense.
Some good high quality alfalfa hay goes a long ways. There's a lot of protein and energy and nutrients in good quality alfalfa for those calves. And again, they don't eat a lot. So if you look at the diet cost per ton, it's usually high, but the feed delivery is pretty low. So the other piece is the animal health side, making sure you've planned ahead.
We are doing something different by weaning them early, and so we're going to take calves and probably put them in a different environment. It might be a grass trap or a smaller pasture. They're going to be a little bit closer contact with each other than just typically out grazing. And so I do think working with your veterinarian to do a vaccination program for the respiratory diseases probably earlier than you typically would if you're going to early wean.
So start that. So a couple take homes, we can have a 30% reduction in the grazing pressure that's out there, and we can do that as early as 6 to 8 weeks and make a difference.
And any time after that. So pull the trigger when you're concerned about
when it makes sense relative to the forage. The other thing I wanted to talk about and address this morning, Dustin, you had a paper come out recently where you looked at cost of BRD, and we spend a lot of time talking about how do we reduce respiratory disease. So BRD is number one disease in the cattle industry, causes us the most expenses. How do we reduce it? your paper looked a little bit, what happens if that would come true?
Right, and so a colleague of mine at USDA, APHIS, and I, we've heard BRD comes up all the time. Technologies, what can we do to reduce it? And so we thought to ourselves, well, what if we had some new technology or genetics or something that was able to reduce prevalence of BRD? What would the impacts be, not only to the beef industry, but to all the other industries? You know, your competing proteins, your forages, grains, etc. And so we took a look at all the different possibilities of technologies, how it could reduce prevalence. We made some assumptions, as we always do. And assuming that we could reduce the prevalence of BRD by 50% in feedlots, what does that mean? Well, assuming there's no change in consumer demand, we're going to have more beef on the market. And what happens when we have more beef on the market?
Actually, prices come down.
Prices are going to come down, right?
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, maybe beef producers might not be better off, but consumers will be better off because there's lower beef prices. Yeah. But now there's also more cattle available. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen to the demand for forages and corn, et cetera?
What does it do to pork and poultry?
And it's also what's it going to do to pork and poultry? Well, now all of a sudden beef is lower. Prices of beef are lower. Yeah. What are consumers going to do?
Buy more beef.
Buy more beef. So they're going to substitute away to more relatively cheaper beef. So
it's going to take more forage and corn to get there.
But it will take more forage and corn to get there. So prices for forages and corn or grains are going to go up. So those producers, your crop producers, will be better off.
So we've got lower beef prices, but we've also got lower input costs, right? So BRD is expensive. I mean, treating BRD in the feed yard is really expensive, right? I mean, a round of Draxxin just kind of makes your eyes, right? So how much does the lower input costs offset from drugs and animal?
And so we never really took a look, never incorporated the costs of that into it. That would be something we'd want to definitely look into. But in terms of feed inputs, those prices will go up.
Those go up, right.
And so, but overall, if you take into account the gains to consumers, because, I like to eat beef and I buy more, lower price, actually it's a net societal win because of offset.
And from welfare standpoint
From a welfare, as well.
It's interesting to me just kind of the ripple effect, because we are in a competitive marketplace, so beef is competing against other proteins, we're competing for feed sources, and so you change one thing, and it does have a ripple effect, and that keeps life interesting.
But this is at a national level.
This is a very high level, kind of macro national level. Correct.
So we're still working towards reducing BRD, especially individual operations. Yeah. Right. So if you reduce it on your operation, there is a benefit to you. If we eliminated it tomorrow throughout the nation, these changes would occur that you're describing.
Right. And so again, we're assuming it's no change in consumer demand. The whole nation changes, and we're looking at the national level. We didn't necessarily dive into at the individual producer level.
There's some advantage too internationally, right? You talk about ripple effect. Mm-hmm. There's some impacts on competing protein here in the U.S., but it makes us more competitive in the global market space too against, say, Brazilian and Australian beef. Right?
It's hard to imagine that increasing efficiency is a bad thing. Right. So that removing some of that inefficiency of disease, respiratory disease, you would think it mostly has a positive. Although, again, it's interesting that there's a ripple.
Yep. No, it's definitely with lower beef prices, we would export more. I mean, we did account for international trade as well, although it wasn't a focus of the study, so we didn't really highlight it.
So that's interesting, and until you start putting those numbers together, you don't really see some of those trends. So we'll be happy if you want to send us your questions. You can send us questions at bci@ksu. You can also send us on Twitter, or you can visit our website and get the email addresses there as well at beefcattleInstitute.org. Thanks for joining us for the BCI Cattle Chat, and we'll talk to you next week.
K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, Bob Weber, and Dustin Pendle of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. Hear the entire podcast at beefcattleInstitute.org. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
listening to Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wichman. In today's agricultural news, more heads of cattle were in feedlots in April from last year, yet the number of heads placed in feedlots over that same time was down sharply. Rod Bain has more.
The inventory for cattle and calves in feedlots on May 1st was 11.6 million head, making that the second highest inventory number for May in the history of USDA's Cattle on Feed report. Agriculture Department livestock analyst Shel Shagam explains why.
We are actually looking at an increasing inventory of cattle, so there is a bigger pool of calves which were born last year, which are available for placement this year. You also have dry conditions in a number of states, which has probably resulted in a fair number of animals which might have been on grass and on forage in the southern plains being placed in feedlots instead.
However, placements on feedlots are down year over year by 8%. According to Shagam,
it does seem like a very sharp decline, but we do have to remember that we are coming off of a very high number last year. That 1.85 million head that were placed in April 2017 was actually the second highest for the month since the series began.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In this week's Tree Tales, K-State Forester Bob Atkinson looks at the benefits that well-designed and established windbreaks can provide.
I am a forester in Kansas, where grass and croplands dominate the landscape. This information can be a catalyst for derisive comments and jokes, which can also become the proverbial window for educational opportunities for those who are actually interested. My dad was also a forester in Kansas for most of his career. Using Fort Hays Experiment Station as his base, he assisted with the planting of thousands of trees for windbreaks and for plantings along the streets and parks of western Kansas communities. It was not uncommon for Dad to enter an extension office playing his harmonica or reciting poetry. Guardian of the Plains was one poem he'd sometimes share. Windbreak trees in orderly rows, ranked like soldiers marching abreast. You spread your leaves where harsh winds blow and provide a haven of comfort and rest. That comfort and rest is not just poetry. Kansas cattle producers indicate that, on average, calving successes increase by 2% if cows are protected by a windbreak. Canadian researchers found that cattle on winter range and unprotected sites required a 50% increase in feed for normal activities, an additional 20% increase to overcome the direct effects of exposure to a combination of cold temperatures and wind. A properly designed windbreak reduces these needs by half. Studies in Montana indicated that during mild winters, beef cattle sheltered by windbreaks gained an average of 34 to 35 pounds, more than cattle in an open feedlot. During severe winters, cattle in feedlots protected from the wind maintained 10.6 pounds more than cattle in unprotected lots. There are many other benefits of windbreaks in the Great Plains: energy savings for farmsteads, reduction of wind-blown soil erosion, wildlife habitat for hunting and other recreational activities. Kansas Forest Service foresters are available to help Kansas farmers and ranchers design and establish successful windbreaks. Please consider giving us a call at 785-532-3310 or check us out on the web at www.kansasforest.org. This is Bob Atkinson with the Kansas Forest Service. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
And in this week's Milk Lines, as the temperatures begin to soar, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk focuses on the importance of properly maintaining milk cooling systems.
As temperatures warm up, a lot of times we start seeing some issues with our milk cooling systems on our dairy farms, and sometimes it's just a matter of cleaning that needs to be done. So if you haven't taken time to clean the compressors and clean the condenser units outside, might be a good time to get those cleaned up and make sure they're tuned up, ready to go for the summertime cooling. Obviously, in the summertime, it's much more difficult to cool milk, and we tax our cooling systems a lot more than what we do in the wintertime. So sometimes some of those little issues that show up during the winter don't really cause us too much trouble, but as we get into summer, we need that extra cooling capacity to be working correctly. So if you haven't scheduled some time with your service representative to come out and check your system, might be a good time to get that done just to make sure that everything is working in tip-top shape and we get those things taken care of before we have problems. So what kind of problems might we see? Well, one of the things we sometimes see is an increase in the overall bacteria counts that we get back from the creamery. May have been running just great during the wintertime, but as we approach warmer weather, we see those start to climb. As that happens, that's an indication that maybe some things aren't happening quite the way they should in the cooling system, and it's a good thing to get that checked out before we get into a serious problem and maybe even run the risk of losing some milk. So have your serviceman come and make the annual service call on those compressors and condensers and other components of the cooling system. Some other things that you might have to consider is just your general cleaning procedure. In the summertime, our systems have the ability to grow bacteria a little more readily than what they do in the wintertime just due to temperature. As temperature increases, the rate at which bacteria reproduce increases greatly. So may have to do a little more diligent job of cleaning the system, and if we've had some problems with a washing pump or something like that, maybe that starts to show up a little more in the summertime than it did in the wintertime, as our cleaning ability is taxed a little more in the summer than it is in the wintertime. So important to get those things checked out as well. This applies not only to the milking equipment but also to the bulk tank washer. If there's some maintenance that needs to be done on the washing system for the bulk tank, probably be a good idea to have your service guy check that out as well as he's on the farm checking out the cooling system to make sure that everything's in tip-top shape and ready for the challenges that we face during the summer. Cows can bring a lot of dirt into the milking system if they have access to mud and wet areas to lay in out in the areas where they might be housed. So if we have some issues that we need to clean up there, need to get that done because we know that in the summertime they will seek out those wet, cool places to lay if given the opportunity. So let's remove the opportunity if it does exist in our facilities so that we can keep the udders as clean as possible. This also will help us with bacteria counts, but also with mastitis and somatic cell counts as well. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, reminding our dairy farmers that it's time to get our milk cooling systems up to snuff for the summertime cooling period.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder from the U.S. Department of Agriculture for dairy farmers, the deadline to enroll in the Improved Margin Protection Program for dairy is this Friday, June 1st. The program protects dairy producers by paying them based on the difference between the national all-milk price and the national average feed cost. Again, that deadline is this Friday. And that's a look at today's agricultural news. This is the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and in the guest chair once more to talk wildlife management. Once again is Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, it's about curbing woodpecker damage to wood-sided dwellings, a perpetual problem that's been studied quite a bit, actually.
It certainly is a widespread problem, and sometimes it's locally severe. There's been some estimates that it causes an average of about $300 a year in damage to homes. Homes that I've looked at seem to have a lot more dollars in damage than that, but I certainly don't look at all of the homes that might have a few holes in them. But it's a problem that causes a lot of consternation for people. The solutions and methods that are used to reduce that woodpecker damage to homes are not real effective. There's been a lot of different techniques out there that have been recommended, including just seal up the openings, seal the hole up, or install some sort of a visual or auditory device that's going to scare the animals away, perhaps a chemical treatment, putting up the owl decoys or plastic rubber snakes in the area, or just simply trap or shoot the animal. But keep in mind that all the songbirds except feral pigeons, house sparrows, and European starlings are protected by the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so lethal control of woodpeckers is rarely an option. If you have to get to that option, lethal control could only be done with the proper federal permit.
We want to talk in a moment about the latest research on what might be attempted to ward woodpeckers away from homes and discourage them from pecking on that wood siding. There are more than a few common woodpecker species in the state, though, right?
Well, there would be 6 species that would cause damage to homes and that would be here in Kansas. They could include the pileated woodpecker, the northern flicker, yellow-bellied woodpecker, the hairy woodpecker, the downy woodpecker, as well as the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Those would be all species that I've heard cause damage and have observed damage from those species here in Kansas. Sometimes it's just a few holes. Sometimes it's a significant damage to a home, and it may not be on just one side.
The surrounding habitat near the home or building, that's key to woodpecker activity, isn't it?
Well, you would think that wildlife all respond to habitat conditions, and what habitat that you have that is conducive to woodpeckers may increase the woodpecker density and the species that would be involved. This particular study was done about 10 years ago, and it looked at habitat. And when they classified yards into 4 categories, those yards that were open, grassy, with few or no shade trees, to lightly wooded, to wooded yards, to heavily wooded, and the heavily wooded yard would have more than 75% of the yard covered with shade trees. So, as you would expect, the more trees seem to indicate the more likely that you would have woodpecker damage. They did this study in upstate New York, and in a broad survey of the community looked at over 1,100 homes that were visited, with 33% of those homes had some form of woodpecker damage. It was either property damage or the nuisance activity, which is just the drumming or the noise that would be conducted. So you can see that in some parts of the country, woodpecker damage can be a significant concern.
Well, dig into this study a little more. Tell us what methods they evaluated for deterring woodpeckers.
They looked at the effectiveness of the 6 control techniques that were commercially available, and those would include prowler owls. That's an owl decoy that has movable wings and a tail that flaps in a breeze, that's often suspended on a pole or sometimes can be hung from a string. They suspended that owl from the eaves or the siding of a home and then allowed that tape to hang from it freely. One other technique was the Bird Pro sound system. It's made by BirdX. It is a distress call. That is the sound of a downy woodpecker in distress. Another one was scare eyes, which are holographic plastic eyes that are strung on a fishing line in the area of where the damage occurs. They also used iridescent tape. It is a mylar tape that's very reflective, designed to scare birds away from an area, a reflective streamer. And then they built suet feeders and roost boxes. So those 6 items would be the control methods that were tested in this particular study. The suet feeders were used only near houses that were experiencing foraging damage. But from what I've observed here in Kansas, I don't believe I've ever looked at a home that the woodpeckers were foraging. Most of the damage is for roost spots or for drumming activity, but in some locations they do find insects in the siding of the home. So they left these devices in place from a range of time up to 62 days, depending upon the season, the weather, and woodpecker activity, and then evaluated the results. They found that the tape was the most effective deterrent that was tested. but it only eliminated damage in about 50% of the trials. So a 50% success rate for the best product, that tells you that none of the methods tested were particularly very effective. The Bird Pro sound system and the Prowler owls each only eliminated damage in 1 out of the 6 trials that they were used in. Suet feeders that were placed near homes, the Woodpecker Damage only ceased in 1 out of 10 trials where that would have been done. So you can see that the techniques that we have to manage problems caused by woodpeckers are not particularly very effective.
So does this suggest that there's really no surefire solution at hand for contending with woodpecker damage?
Well, keep in mind that even though we don't have real effective control techniques, sometimes the animals are individual, and some of these techniques, frightening devices, seem to work well for some people, and others do not simply get any relief at all.
Well, it's a rather challenging problem for a number of homeowners, what to do about those woodpeckers hammering away on their wood siding, on their homes, on their outbuildings. And there's what research says about what does and doesn't work. Charlie, thanks for the word right here. He's a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. With that, our time is away for today. Thanks for tuning in. And for Jeff Wichman, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.